Well, hello everybody and greetings from the Mind Science Institute and Richard Hill here in Sydney, Australia. What's interesting, what's happening, lots of stuff. There's lots of stuff about DNA and microRNAs, and there's quite a bit of stuff about various other things, microglia in the brain. Pretty technical, but have a look at some Science Direct and Science, the AAAS, but I think that's a bit too technical for today. What I want to talk about is something that I caught my eye, which I thought was really interesting, because this thing of understanding the brain and how its connections make a difference in the way we function. And so there was an article, and it was quite interesting. It was followed up on CNN website. So CNN, I have the links down there. Elizabeth Landau did this write-up looking at some of the prehistory of stuff. Also, there's some neat little videos that you can watch that CNN have done discussions. Lovely one with Helen Fisher about the female brain and the male brain. But this talk is about connections in the brain, and particularly in relation to the nature of psychopathology, the psychopath, what is going on. Now, the discussion was prompted by a paper that's just in press at the moment, and that's in, what have we got, Biological Psychiatry. I'll read the title here. Functional Connectivity Bias in the Prefrontal Cortex of Psychopaths. And it's, let me see, Contreras Rodriguez and his team, and he comes from the Bellvitge University Hospital in Barcelona. But this thing, again, talking about the connections between the prefrontal cortex and in psychopaths, between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic area. So it's not that they don't know things are happening, they aren't aware of things, they're unconscious of the moral issues. They just don't get a feeling about it, they don't get a strong emotive connection to it, and it is emotional load, it is emotional drive that drives us to make decisions in various directions. That's to shift us from what's going on. So this looks at that aspect of connection between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic area. And what you might like to do is have a little look around, because one of the conditions which doesn't lead to a psychopathology, sort of these people who don't seem to have a good moral compass, but it leads to a sense of emotional, self-emotional connect, and that is alexithymia, which also has this issue of prefrontal cortex to limbic area. And I would think, in the one I talked about last week, the area of the brain, the insula, that sense of inner connection, that sense of awareness of an intuitive, of an inner sensitivity, as different from the precuneus, the posterior areas of the parietal or posterior and cingulate, that are looking at the sense of I, the I in space. So we have these different areas. And what do they do when they connect with each other, in the sense of making us an integrated and connected human being, as we talk about in interpersonal neurobiology? And what happens when they don't communicate with each other, when they have disconnections, when they have either lack of actual synaptic connections, or they have suppression of the synaptic connections, which is the GABAergic neurons, a higher percentage of GABAergic neurons, or perhaps a higher process of serotonergic stimulation of the GABAergic neurons. So there's quite a lot to look up there. This is interesting. Go have a look at the CNN article, have a look at some of their videos, go if you can into the literature and see if you can see this paper. It's a pre-press at the moment, so it should be out pretty soon. And I think you'll find it very interesting. The nature of connection between the prefrontal cortex and what is going on elsewhere. There's my phone. No, you're not having strange bells in your head, but I'm not going to answer that because you're more important. Because the last thing I want to mention before I go is what's coming up. And there's an interesting thing coming up in Sydney in Australia, and that's cognitive therapy training. Cognitive therapy, Bruce Ecker, who's one of the wonderful members of the advisory board for the neuropsychotherapist, and an all-round great guy. Really interesting therapy he's developed, and of course he's very important in the area of memory reconsolidation and memory consolidation, in the sense of resolving the associations of past traumas. So have a look at that. Now, they've got a workshop going on in Sydney in, let me check the date, July 5th and 6th. I think you'll find there's some other mentions on the site because Matthew might be going to that because he's interested in that work as well. And so check that out. They're sending out one of their wonderful guys, Niall Gogan, who's qualified in this area. But if you're not in Australia, go check out the Coherence Therapy website. Go and have a look at what Bruce is doing, and perhaps he's got some things going around near you. That's all for now. I've had my 5 minutes, and I thank you very much for listening. As always, be wonderful, be amazed, be curious, and have a good week. Bye.
Hello, Matthew. Dr. Dave here once again with news about the latest podcast interview from Shrink Wrap Radio. And this is number 398, getting very close to the century mark of number 400. What a journey it's been, and what a joy it is really to have the opportunity to talk to all of these very accomplished and fascinating people. And I'm eager to tell you about this week's interview, which is with Dr. Tobin Hart, who is a professor at the University of West Georgia and an author. And I actually interviewed him 7 years ago. Sometimes people ask me, well, what is the most memorable interview that you've ever done? Well, I always have trouble answering that question because there have been so many good ones. But I very clearly remember one that I did with Dr. Hart some 7 years ago in relation to a book that he wrote about the spirituality of children. And it was a real eye-opener for me, but also I was struck by his depth, his wisdom, his ease of speaking about deep matters. And equally so this time, now 7 years later, about his latest book, the title of which is The Four Virtues: Presence, Heart, Wisdom, Creation. This is what the book looks like. I wasn't crazy about the title, and I asked him about it, since virtue is not in very common usage these days, for better or for worse. And he told me actually that was a title that was suggested or maybe even forced upon him by the publisher, and that his title was A Field Guide to the Inner Life. That's a title I like quite a bit. I titled the episode before I knew about his subtitle. I decided that I would title this episode A Plan for Long-Term Life Satisfaction. So either one of those two, I think, fits this a lot better than the Four Virtues. It's a wonderful interview. He's such a great guest. And as I say, he just speaks with such wonderful depth and wisdom. And I don't know what to say beyond that about him. He just, he feels like a very special person. I always feel blessed after having spoken with him. So somebody who I feel very much on the same page with. And I wish I had his level of adept skill in spontaneous conversation that way. I must say, I always find talking to the camera here very challenging, and yet I force myself to do it and to push ahead. So that's all I've got to say this time around. And so until next week, Dr. Dave here signing off.